Thank you, Austin. A pleasant afternoon to all. We will now officially start the webinar. To our distinguished and eminent speakers, to our media friends and partners, friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the online webinar with the theme Global Risk Facing the Marcos Presidency, Rising Prices Worldwide, US-China Tensions,
Recording in progress.
Ukraine-Russia Conflict, and the South China Sea Dispute. My name is Ana Malindo Uy, and together with Mr. Paul Gutierrez, we will serve as the moderators of this webinar. As we all know, during the initial stage of the Ukraine crisis, the Philippine Stock Exchange Index traded down. Though the Philippines may be far from Ukraine, nonetheless, what's going on in that part of the world is affecting the country and the rest of the world without exception. The possible further escalation of the Ukraine crisis poses a threat not only to Europe's economic and financial stability, but to the world at large. Some of the immediate ramification of the Ukraine crisis and its possible escalation is the so-called inflationary crunch, which drives up energy and wheat prices in Asia and the Philippines even higher and pushes up the prices of essential goods and commodities. The Ukraine crisis and its economic impact, no doubt, taken together, is a double whammy for the developing countries like the Philippines, which are trying to bounce back from the devastating economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, as a country, the Philippines is also affected by the intensified US-China tensions, rivalry, and competition. One of the theaters of this US-China contest is the disputed South China Sea, of which the Philippines is one of the claimant states, and so is China. The convergence and confluence of all these global conjectures and crises pose a huge challenge to the newly democratically constituted Philippine government under the leadership of President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. amid the pursuit of a quick economic bounce back and recovery from the negative impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. On this note, the webinar today will tackle, explore, and provide perspective on possible explanation on how the new administration should respond to the global risks affecting the country today, such as rising prices worldwide, US-China tensions, Ukraine-Russia conflict, and the South China Sea disputes. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me call on the Program Manager of the Integrated Development Studies Institute, Mr. Austin Ong, for the welcome remarks. Austin, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone, friends and new friends alike from all over the world. We have friends from the government, from the academe, and also from the media. As I said, we are very fortunate to be with global speakers, global thinkers today. But at the same time, we are facing tremendous challenges and risks. The Philippines right now, we're still in a bit of a euphoria from our recent elections. But at the same time, we do face incoming challenges that not only the government, but the people have to prepare for. So without further ado, we are looking forward to a very engaging and interactive discussion with our experts. Just a little bit of a house rules. Please put your name and your organization on your profile. We will delete comments that are not respectful to the speakers. We will keep the questions open. You can ask any questions as long as it's relevant to the topic at hand. And our speakers are actually excited to get the critical and engaging questions. We will priority questions from the media, from the government, and then from the academe. We also have students, especially researchers in our audience. So we will give time for that later. And as you know, after the 1 hour program, we will have a little bit of a chica moments at the end. So please stay tuned. Some of our experts might have to leave, but the ones who stay will answer personal questions that you might like, and we might even open the floor for you to ask the questions directly. Without further ado, I'll return it back to Anna and Paul for the program proper. And thank you everybody for joining us again this afternoon. Magandang hapon. Anna, you're on mute. Asking you, you're on mute now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Austin, for that warm welcome remarks and for some house rules. Friends and colleagues, allow me to introduce the first speaker of this webinar. Our first speaker this afternoon is an internationally recognized expert of the multipolar world. He served as a member of the advisory boards of Fortune, Bloomberg, Businessweek, and McKinsey. He advises the OECD, EU government agency, Nordic councils, central banks, multinationals, and think tanks around the world. He works with the India, China, America, American Institute, Shanghai Institute for International Studies, and the EU Center in Singapore. As a senior Fulbright scholar, he worked with Harvard's Institute for Strategies and Competitiveness, Columbia Graduate School of Business, and New York University. He was interviewed by over 200 major media entities worldwide, the likes of CNBC, Bloomberg, Reuters, Associated Press, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and Channel News Asia. His economic analysis have been quoted by Fortune, Forbes, Foreign Affairs, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the European Business Review, the World Financial Review, and the Financial Times, and the Economist, and many more. With great pride, ladies and gentlemen, our first speaker for today is the founder of the global think tank, Difference Group, Dr. Dan Steinbock. Dr. Dan, Dr. Steinbock, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for the very flattering intro. I would like to start with the slides, and if Austin, you can help me out a little bit, can we move to the next slide right away? So I will talk about the global risks and the global economic outlook, and I have only 4 points to make. One, that the state of globalization we have currently is extremely dire. Second, that the Ukraine conflict is serving or functioning as a geopolitical accelerator in this state of globalization. Third, that we are also seeing something new, that's something that should be very distressing, the privatization of conflicts, and I will come to that. And finally, there are certain Philippine policies that now matter more than ever. But as to the globalization and this part of the presentation, and I will give the sources afterwards if there's interest, was published by the Austrian Central Bank only a week or two ago. I believe that we are now, at least from the economic outlook point of view, in the most dangerous situation since 1945. First of all, if you look at the world trade, there was a possibility, a promising situation in 2017 where we might have had a global recovery. It didn't happen. And the reason it did not happen was the trade wars that were supposed to help in terms of trade deficits and so forth, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, it did none of that. Instead, what we've seen is a situation where the trade as a percentage of the world GDP has fallen back where it was last time about 15 years ago. So that's rate regression. Secondly, world investment, another indicator of globalization. In 2 decades of 2 decades of progress that we've had has been reversed in just few years, in just 2 or 3 years. That requires skills in regression. Third, absolute number of international migrants has tripled in the past 50 years. But seriously, if you put this into historical context, even today, the number of international migrants is only 1/3 of what it was already a century ago. So it is not the case that borders are in any way opening. On the contrary, they are closing. Finally, and most distressingly, global displacement. Today, the number of globally displaced is over 100 million. That is extraordinary. It is more than twice as high as it was after 2 world wars, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Holocaust. And we are in peacetime conditions. If I can have the next slide, please. So in this kind of situation, the global outlook, unfortunately, can only be dire. It is compounded by debt crisis, trade wars, pandemic, depression, and what I would consider to be new policy mistakes. We see a situation where I believe stagflation became a real problem already towards the end of the last year. Not everybody wanted to hear that message. Now we are in the situation where even World Bank is recognizing the threat, but it took half a year to get there. Now, if we look at the world growth, we are in a situation where recession could become possible, viable relatively soon. And if you look at the cumulative output losses here on the right-hand side, and you look at the category EMDE, emerging markets and developing economies, you'll find that those countries that will be most hit by situation, by food prices, by energy prices, are emerging economies that are commodity importers. That we have already seen. If I can have the next slide, please. If the equation, if the status quo wasn't difficult and challenging enough, it has been made far more serious by the conflict in Ukraine, which I would characterize as a hybrid proxy war. It will lead and has already led to higher inflation in addition to what we had before, and it will tighten the financial conditions. There are several reasons why this happens, and I'm sure that the other speakers will speak more of this. Just a few notes. 4 scenarios, 4 theories. One is the theory that this was actually a repetition of the so-called Presidency trap, which was set in the 70s to attract the troops of Soviet Union into Afghanistan, and then create a Soviet Vietnam, that there was something like this going on here. The second argument, which I personally think is very relevant, is that the NATO expansion that has continued from 1989 to the present eastward, it was never supposed to happen. It has created structural conditions for increasing defensiveness in a very delicate part of Europe. Third, regime change. We might also call it democratization if we are in the West, starting from 2014 and the first Ukraine war at the time. The very same actors that were present at the time, such as Victoria Nuland, who is now the second in command right behind Mr. Antony Blinken, and Blinken himself, Sullivan, and even Biden, the same actors that were active then are active now. Fourth, there was the famous or notorious RAND report from 2019 called The Overextending and Unbalancing Russia, which basically argued that by creating a conflict that provides sort of a platform to weaken Russia itself. So the real point is not really the war, it is the destabilization of Russia. That is a very serious game under this current circumstances. I also feel that we've seen several things as a result already, as net effects, misjudgments by Ukraine in terms of their hopes, what might have happened and what will happen next, in terms of NATO and US, in terms of how fast this conflict could be resolved in a way that would benefit the Western powers. And great illusions on the part of European Union and European monetary area in the sense of this great ambitious faith to transition into more sustainable economy within months, which hasn't happened for almost 40, 50 years. And finally, on the part of Russia, I think that there was also a feeling that this would be a shorter operation overall, but it wasn't, and it isn't. It will be longer. And if you look at the left, here you have Ukraine 2014, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and here the present situation. I also want to add one point. There has been a lot of talk in Western media about how Russia's intentions really are far bigger, far more ambitious, go to Eastern Europe, go even to Baltic and Scandinavia. I think that Russia has limited its objectives very much to Ukraine, and I would be very surprised if anything else happens, except as a result of a major provocation by any part in the conflict. Next slide, if I may. Now, in terms of the economy and the policy mistakes I mentioned, here we have a situation of stagflationary risks. The US annual inflation rate was still in May 8.6%. It was supposed to come down quite a long time ago. Towards the end of last year, Mr. Powell, the head of Fed, said that what we're seeing, the kind of inflation that we're seeing, is fleeting. It will go away. It's transitionary. Well, it wasn't. And the Ukraine crisis makes it all the more persistent. As a result, we've seen this very complicated situation where US that had been cutting the rates deep down is now trying to move very fast to increase them while engaging in quantitative tightening. So you have a situation where first the Federal Reserve undershoot, and now it's overshooting. Some of the members of the central bank were foresightful enough already 5-6 years ago, warning that if we take this tack, we may create a deja vu with the 1970s. And there are elements of that here. If you look at how this plays out in the case of ASEAN, and here the title of the picture, unfortunately, is wrong. It really is about ASEAN. The reason why it's hitting ASEAN and why it is hitting Southeast Asia so powerfully is that due to the economic development, food and fuel have a far greater share in the expenses of ordinary households. And as a result, when you have inflation of prices, whether it's about fuel or food, that will cost a lot. So in ASEAN, ASEAN's 6 biggest economies, the consumer price inflation basket is 20 to 40% for food items alone. You add fuel, we talk about 50 to 60% of the basket. So when these prices go up, every second family will feel it in ASEAN. And then if I can have the next slide. There's also something new going on with the preparation for what my American friends like to call democratization and what my Chinese friends like to call destabilization. That's the following. In the present Biden administration, the key player in terms of Asian policies, the so-called Asia czar, has been Kurt Campbell, who created this notion of pivot to Asia a long while ago, 10 years ago. Now, when he left the Obama administration, he went private. He created his own company called the Asia Group. And that group became very popular very fast because he had a marquee name. He had a very attractive, high-profile name. Now, Jake Sullivan did something similar. When Hillary Clinton's campaign failed, he left and joined a company called Macro Advisory Partners, in which the British intelligence chiefs have played a great role. Antony Blinken joined West Exec together with Michel Flournoy, who is a very powerful background factor in all of this. Now, these private companies, then West Exec created a joint venture or strategic partnership with Pine Island, which is about venture capital portfolio funds, whose members are now Blinken and Lloyd Austin until they became members of the Biden administration. Their biggest clients are the big defense. In other words, those defense contractors that are global by their operations and very large in terms of their market capitalization. Their clients also include the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office, which is a de facto or effective Taiwanese embassy, if you will, in the US. So these clients shape the agendas. Naturally, when these members joined the administration, they took distance from these organizations. Others strongly, others not so strongly. Nonetheless, there's this issue of potential moral hazard. There's this issue of alleged interest conflicts. US media has been very vocal about these issues and was so already in January, February. And I think that what we've seen, the aggressiveness of the geopolitics indicates that if the defense contractors certainly aren't driving national policies, but their interests are being taken into account. And that is very unfortunate in this situation. And I should also mention Lal Barnard, who is the wife of Mr. Campbell and who is now in charge of the decisions of the Fed in terms of rate cuts and tightening. So there's few peoples that hold quite a lot of power in this regard. If I can have the next slide. So the real issue, and this is a very complicated one, and I would be curious to hear what my colleagues here think about it, is how do you cultivate national interest in basically an era that's when we are globally interdependent? In these particular cases, when we talk about think tanks or administrations or defense contractors, it's one thing, but they have then parallels that reflect, I believe, in ASEAN. One example is the Strat-based ADR Institute for Strategic and International Studies, whose studies have been very intriguing and very interesting. And but when you look at the ownership relationships and the role of the key players, those who sponsor this particular institute, and the power that they hold in terms of their holding company, in terms of their ultimate Indonesian owner, I believe, and then all kinds of other subsidiaries that go from Metro Pacific, PLDT to Philex Mining, and that have then arms going to Maynilad, Meralco, and so on and so forth, and that own certain kind of media. It gets more problematic. By this, I am certainly not saying that there is a direct causal relationship that the owner determines the policies. But it's harder for those media to go against sometimes their owners. We've seen in the so-called big world how that happens. If Washington Post or its editors, its writers, or New York Times want to have a scoop, they might be told that, look, if you do this, it will limit our access to decision makers. It's a very difficult balancing act. And what makes the situation even more complex is that when you look at the ADR, some of its key executives are also part of a private company, Stratbase, which has links with Power Group Asia, which had links with US ASEAN Business Council, which is linked with a whole lot of other organizations, and ADR itself with the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, and CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the most powerful US think tanks in this area. So the benign way of looking at this is to think that, well, these are great points of access. This way we can better understand what happens in the major economies, such as the United States, and thereby take into account their possible views in the region. The not so benign view is that this will limit strategic flexibility, and this will limit what people can do and say. If I can have the next slide, the second last one. I believe that if we have seen anything ever since the Great Recession, 2008 and 9, it is that national interest matters. And if we take a long perspective to the Philippines, and this is the way I understand the comments of the new president, we should really feel distressed and apprehensive about the fact that in the post-war era, Philippines was seen as the most likely economy to succeed, to grow fast in Southeast Asia. And yet, over time, it has fallen behind the several peer countries. And I personally feel, and of course, this is possible debate, there were efforts to that direction before, but I personally feel that when you look at the purposeful national industrialization, that only began under President Duterte in 2016. Build, build, build. The idea was to create a physical infrastructure, interconnectedness, and thereby pave the way for human capital, which is something that I believe his daughter is after right now in the new administration. But this took such a long time. So the question is not so much can we, or should we rewrite the history? We always rewrite the history. The question is, what are we going to do now? How are we going to move towards the future? And if we renounce our national interest or think that it only pertains to 1 to 10% of the nation, that is a serious mistake. And I think that many pre-Duterte administrations did that. If I can have this last slide. So independent foreign policy matters. And it matters a lot. And it matters far more than ever before currently. If you look at the BRICS and their development, my dear acquaintance Jim O'Neill, when he created the term, noticed something that then has become sort of an axiom, and that is that those countries that are successful in their economic development have a zero conflict principle. At one point, Turkey had it. At another point, China had it. It is very, very difficult to sustain it. I think that what is needed in Philippines is an independent foreign policy that primarily and paramountly looks at the Philippine national interest. And it should also be closely coordinated with ASEAN, partly because there are so many affinities, so many parallels with ASEAN, and partly because through ASEAN you have a greater voice in international policies. About 10 years ago, I had the pleasure to be in Singapore as a visiting scholar. And one of the many people I had also a privilege to meet was Tommy Koh. He was a key player in the creation of the platform of the constitution of the ASEAN. And he told me how whenever he would go to Europe, the Europeans would kind of jokingly chide him for not being integrated enough. And Ko would say that, look, well, in ASEAN, we are very diverse and we don't want to have a kind of a straitjacket. We want to have independence and unity, sovereignty and cooperation. And honestly, when you look at back 10 years, you can make a case for Tommy Ko. What we've seen in Europe is great difficulties when you can't devaluate in certain countries and you should reevaluate it in other countries. So here we have a situation where President Marcos Jr. wants to continue the Philippine special relationship with the US, but also hopes to find ways to resolve the conflicts with China. He has declared his support for independent foreign policy of his predecessor, former President Duterte. This is what we feel is best in the national interest, he said. He rejects the idea of aligning with just one country, saying you have to be friends to everyone. You don't want to be enemies with anyone. However, if you look at the right-hand side of the picture, and this is the reason why I've wrote a piece for the World Financial Review, some of the slides I've used here come from that. I happened to see this TV broadcast show by NBC News. Behind it was CNAS, the think tank that has been led by Michel Fournier and where Blinken has played a role and so on and so forth. They prepared a scenario for US-China-Taiwan war 2027. And there you can see in the upper hand picture on the left, troops and countries are a bit like chips in a great chessboard. And there underneath, there is a red enemy, which seems to be China. I had to ask myself, where did this year come from? 2027. I haven't heard any Chinese leader make reference to the fact that they intend to start a war with Taiwan 2027, or any war for that matter. I personally believe that they would try to do anything that they can to avoid it. They want to build economy. It turns out that this came from a retired American admiral who said in a hearing in Congress that he believes there might be a war in 2027. This happened a year ago. And CNAS used this as a basis for this scenario. These kind of simulations are understandable, but they're frightening because they get us used to the idea of war. They get us adjusted to that idea so that when it happens, and if it ever happens, God forbid, we take it almost for granted. It was bound to happen, we say. Understand the implication. Look at the right-hand side slide, which is from the study by CNAS, the same think tank that I mentioned earlier, and I had the slide of those moral hazards. It has several areas in East and Southeast Asia that would be centers of conflict. Southern China, Eastern China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and also Philippines. You can't avoid it. And if we factor in the possibility of nuclearization, which has escalated for a year or two now because of the AUKUS alliance, it would be all the more prevalent. So I think that the fact that President Marcos Jr. now has dedicated himself for the independent foreign policy, which is the only way really to build that upper middle income economy he's after. And I think what would benefit the Filipinos the most. The only way to achieve this is through peace. Through peace, you create stability. Through stability, you create prosperity. Any conflict will undermine it. And then we might have a situation like in Ukraine. And that's to be avoided at any cost. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Steinbock, for that extensive, thought-provoking, and very enlightening presentation and discussion. Moving forward, allow me to introduce our second speaker. Our second speaker was the former head of the Political Science Committee of the University of the Philippines, Manila. He is an investigative journalist, editor, and publisher of various newspapers and online publications. He has written more than 300 investigative reports and analysis and co-authored 10 books on political parties and electoral reform, governance and corruption, foreign policy and national security, international affairs, and peace process. He is regularly invited as a resource expert in international fora, including the US, Europe, and Asia. Once again, friends and colleagues, join me in welcoming the second speaker of this afternoon webinar, the Director for Policy Studies of the Center for People Empowerment and Governance, or CENPEG, Professor Bobby Tuazon. Professor Bobby, the floor is yours po.
Professor
Sir,
Bobby, you're on mute. You'll need to unmute. Let me help you.
Unmute po, sir.
I'm requesting you to unmute. There you go. You're
Yes, yeah, thank you, Professor Anna and Austin. Let me just add a brief observation in the Asia-Pacific region with respect to the tensions building up over Taiwan. This issue was mentioned by our main speaker at the last final stretch of his presentation, so I'm going to build on it. I look at the Taiwan issue as a major plus point in the Asia-Pacific region. And it is there where, if possible, I'm saying just if possible, war could erupt anytime now. And right now, there is already a confluence of events and elements that are emerging that could make that happen now or in the immediate future. Of course, Taiwan is a core interest of China. It is a core interest of China, not only because it is an island province of China that was stolen by Japan after the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, in the signing of the so-called Treaty of Shimonoseki. So it was stolen by Japan, and from then on, Taiwan became separate from China. Not only until its independence in 1949, but also until today. Now, as a core interest of China, the Beijing government has stipulated that it will continue to pursue the peaceful reunification with Taiwan. But, and this is a big but, if Taiwan, the moment it decides to declare independence from China, especially with the support of the US, then that will be a different case. And China has all the right to use military means to avoid China from being split between China and Taiwan. So that's one important thing. Now, where's the problem coming from? Where are the tensions coming from? The tensions in Taiwan are born out of the fact that the US has been making provocative actions against China over Taiwan that have included major naval exercises across the Taiwan Straits every month. No? There's one major naval exercise over across the Taiwan Straits every month. The US has been equipping the Taiwan military with military aid, military equipment, and has sold weapons to Taiwan to the tune of about $70 billion, $70 billion to date. That's billion, not in million. Now, all these are encouraging Taiwan, therefore, to move forward toward the edge of declaring its own independence, in violation of the One China principle that was agreed upon by the US and China when both countries forged diplomatic relations sometime in 1975, and which the United Nations itself adopted, where China retook its seat as not only a member of the United Nations, but also as a permanent member of the Security Council. So these are all in violation of the international law, in violation of the One China principle. The U.S. says is interpreted as pursuing what they call a strategic ambiguity policy over the Taiwan issue. But of course, to me, it's very clear that the U.S. is provoking China to a possible war, to push China to bring the war. And the U.S. is supported, by the way, by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So you have here two powers, namely the U.S. on the one hand and the NATO countries on the other, who are pretty much thickly involved now in the Ukraine war, who are also involved in the over the Taiwan issue. I consider on this note, we can consider for the U.S. as the biggest strategic security threat to the Asia-Pacific region, not the other way around, where the U.S. has described China as a strategic threat to American security. It is a threat to the Asia-Pacific region, including the Philippines, which, by the way, still maintains a strong security alliance with the U.S. The danger there, therefore, is that if any complex event takes place, like a war between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, then the Philippines will be embroiled, will be enmeshed in that unavoidable war. Why? Of course, because the Philippines is a security ally of the U.S. So, in the final analysis, I think what the challenges are to the Marcos administration, if the Marcos foreign policy experts will study it well and consider the consequences on the security of the Philippines and also on the economy of the Philippines, is that the Marcos administration should start reviewing its security alliance with the U.S. It should start reviewing the Visiting Forces Agreement and other security treaties, including the Mother Treaty of the so-called Mutual Defense Pact of 1951, toward a possible repeal of those agreements. I would like to say this because it would be difficult for the Marcos administration to stay the course of an independent foreign policy unless it severs itself from the clutches, from the chain of being a subordinate country to the U.S. It cannot maintain an independent foreign policy unless it is bound to its security commitments with the U.S., which can be used by the U.S. to push the Philippines to support American aggression, not only in Asia, but elsewhere in the world. So that's my policy recommendation. I would have wanted to add more by saying that, yes, we have flashpoints. Yes, we have conflicts. Yes, we have the Ukraine war. But if we look at the other perspective, the world system is changing. It is now emerging to be a multipolar system, not dominated by a hegemonic power, and that's a good start to change the world. Well, I can respond to other questions related to that, but my time is up. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Professor Bobby Tuazon, for that equally extensive, very enlightening, and very thought-provoking as well explanation, discussion, and presentation. Now, let me introduce our last but not the least speaker in this webinar this afternoon. The third and last speaker of this webinar is a Wharton-trained economist or economic analyst. He advised the Philippines since the Ramos administration and various business organizations in trade negotiation with ASEAN, Japan, and the United States. He is a successful international trade practitioner, investor, and business developer across various industries, including technology, finance, services, marketing, communication software, and real estate development. He is often invited as a resource person for government agency, public and private organization, and local and international media like the CNN, Bloomberg, China Daily, Channel News Asia, ANC Inquirer, and many others. He is the chairperson of the Federation of Filipino-Chinese Chambers of Commerce and Industry, Trade and Industry Committee, and the chairman emeritus of the dynamic Anvil Business Club. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome the Director of Integrated Development Studies Institute, Mr. George C., for his presentation and speech. Take it away, Sir George. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Welcome, Dr. Steinbock, joining us again today. I'd like to also, on behalf of IDC, thank our friends in media, the hardworking, honest ones at least, the academe, the military, government, and the students who have joined us today. They asked for three major challenges of this administration. Of course, everyone has their own view of what might be challenges. I'd like to bring up two that are not got to do with foreign policy and, of course, foreign policy. The immediate one, number one, the most important short-term item to address is always the one that affects people's livelihoods the most. This inflation on food and basic transport and electricity, we have seen what can immediately and very quickly descend into chaos if people have a problem with food. It almost happened to us during the pandemic when people started taking over food resources and places to live. So this is something we have to prepare for, that in fact the BBM, President Bongbong Marcos, has already indicated that he's going to address these issues. Then we'll have to see that. That's very basic, the food and inflation that affects daily lives. In fact, the Octa survey showed that if put against the other issues, the South China Sea issue in the Philippines that some parties want to keep playing up are actually in the 3% level, 2 to 3% level of consciousness only, and the greatest is there, but has a very, very big impact. The reason I consider it, or many people will consider it as a major item, is because the cost of implementing it is not very high. The impact is very great, not short term, but in medium term. That means in a year, 2 years, the impact is already felt. That is the Industrial Revolution number 4. That means that we have to address our education and the digitalization of our economy, because that can immediately reduce traffic, increase enterprise without a lot of investment. So that's the second thing that we have to address. It's a medium-term thing. And the third thing that I would consider propose to the government that is very, very important is, of course, this foreign policy issue. It's a medium term in that, if you don't have the food and inflation addressed, this might become secondary. But in the medium term, it is very fundamental because it could eliminate all the advantages of everything else. Now, if we look at, for instance, Ukraine, a powerful manufacturing sector, a powerful agricultural sector, a very big country, beautiful country, but it could descend into war and everything gets wiped out. And they keep, some Western countries keep proposing and pushing them to continue fighting. And in fact, Western media, as pointed out by Dr. Steinbock and others, keep indicating their victories when actually they've already lost 20% of their territory, a lot of their manufacturing and agricultural sectors, and they're still being pushed to continue fighting. So we would say, let's not get into that situation. Let's sidestep the issue, but we want a certain proposal that we don't need to keep addressing defensively and react and respond to how the powers tell us that they want us to be in this position or that. We can actually take the initiative to help shape in ASEAN and in the West and in the world how the policies are formulated. We can start helping shape the directions of these. So just as especially at this point when there's a lot of turning points for Russia, for the US, for China, Japan, they're all facing turning points. So our input in this area being one of the levered areas that has a lot of influence towards what outcomes will be, we can take a more proactive position. Thank you. These are three of the initiatives we believe would have a good impact.
Okay. Thank you, Sir George, for that also very short but very enlightening discussion on the challenges for the President BBM's leadership or administration, and your suggestions to him and to the whole administration. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we move now to the second part of our webinar, which is the most exciting part, I think, and this is the question and answer portion, or we throw questions. So I think let me ask all of them, all of our speakers, the first question. I think let's have it more on the Duterte administration first. Now let's assess. How would you grade or how would you assess the Duterte's foreign policy, especially what you call the independent foreign policy of the Duterte administration and the relationship of his administration vis-a-vis China and the United States? So any one of you can respond to the question. So probably I'll ask Dr. Steinbock first, and then followed by Professor Bobby, and then Sir George.
Okay, thank you for the question. And I keep mine short since I spoke so long. When it comes to President Duterte's foreign policy, I would characterize it as transformative. It was the first time in years that I felt hope. I felt optimism. I felt that there's a new page, there's a new chapter that is being written. But naturally, when you're a pioneer, you have to fight a lot of obstacles, and that's what happened. The policy itself, I think, was well intended. Its objectives were clear, and the problem was that not everybody in the administration used the same language or the same concepts. And I think that there was certain kind of a centrifugal pressures even within the government in that regard. But nonetheless, I felt it was transformative. And I think that it opened also the discussion and the dialogue with China in an amazing way. That doesn't mean that things will change immediately, but it paved the way for further, more, I think, practical progress with the BBM administration.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Dan. What about you, Professor Bobby? Any comment? Answer to the question? Unmute, sir. Ask to unmute. Austin, please.
Yeah, well, the 6-year Duterte administration was practically walking on a very thin line, being pulled by big rocks or major powers, namely the US and China. So it was very difficult for Duterte himself, who declared early on that he was going to pursue an independent foreign policy by first engaging China with a strong, robust, comprehensive strategic economic cooperation, but on the other hand, continuing to engage with the US, not on the economy, but on security matters, because the US no longer has any economic power to offer, economic resources to offer to the Philippines. It is unfortunate, however, that there were two obstacles that prevented the Duterte administration from going ahead with this so-called, at least rhetorically, declared independent foreign policy. One is that there was a strong uh, military presence. And the military institution in the Philippines, like all other presidents, has had a strong voice. Even if you say they are merely for defense or for military, but to me, in our own accounts, have even transcended their powers to be involved in foreign policy issues. I can name many events, many issues where the DND was first to talk, was first uh, uh, to declare its voice and uh, beyond or up, and the DFA would have to catch up on that. So it was difficult, and the role of the Philippine military, of course, is to serve the security interests of the US. That is expected because the military until now has been receiving lots of military aid from the US. And most of its generals are trained in the US, indoctrinated, trained in cyber tactics, counterinsurgency, and so on and so forth. The second obstacle is that no country can have an independent foreign policy without a strong and stable economy. If you don't have a strong and stable economy, you will continue to depend on China, on the US, and that will hamper your efforts to be independent, not be bound by any foreign interest, and so on and so forth. So I hope that the new administration will somehow learn these lessons. Good that Marcos Jr. says that the economy is his priority. Let's see how it will work out, and let's see how this economic development will help propel a more independent foreign policy stance of the government.
Thank you, Professor Bobby. Sir George, do you have some um, comment on the question?
Yes, two aspects. One is what does the record show, and the other is how is it being addressed currently by the administration as we go into a new one. The record shows that whereas the opposition keeps saying what are the benefits we obtained from this independent foreign policy, and we keep bringing it up in IDSI, just to name a few because there have been very extensive benefits. No, one is they don't point out that there was a forgiveness of $120 million loan that was outright forgiven. So there's nothing to match from the West. No, aside from over $100 million donated for infrastructure that has been donated, which is the two bridges. They come from China, no? And then there's also the pandemic assistance, which came some 4 or 5 months ahead of any help from the West. In fact, the West had blocked the arrival of vaccines, and these 4 or 5 months head start saved tens of thousands of lives. If we look at the number and the pace at which people were dying because of the pandemic. Not only that, but based on our own NEDA estimates, probably saved us $1 trillion or more pesos because of the hundreds of billions we saved every month. So these are direct benefits. There's also the highest growth in tourism we ever had in private investments in comparison. And also we have to see also that substantially during the last 3 years, we had a doubling of the coverage of our digital cell phone access, as well as the speed, which allowed some level of education to continue to take place, which means without that, many of our schools would not have been able to continue education in the last 2 years of the pandemic. Of course, the most telling one is when we had the Marawi crisis, in which ISIS tried to take over parts of Mindanao. The U.S. actually blocked the sale of arms and ammunition to us, including the shipments from the EU. And then China and Russia gave us plane loads of arms. And then later on, in fairness, the US came in and assisted, and this government was able to turn back this ISIS threat within 8 months, which is a fantastic thing that people have to appreciate, that very few countries, most countries once entered have collapsed. No? And here in 8 months, we had resolved that issue. And okay, in terms of the investments, we have to see that even with this maybe a more aggressive stance towards the West, actually, because of economic realities, once Chinese and other investments started coming in, and the demographics of the Philippines in terms of the growth of the middle class because of this, and the digitalization of the economy, brought in clusters of investments such that they may not realize this. The amount of even though he was maybe the president was as a play, or if he really believed it, was attacking the West, we received multiples, maybe 4 or 5 times more investment in this administration than we did in the previous administration, which was very friendly to the West. We're not saying we should attack them. If we can use charm, I always believe charm is useful, but maybe sometimes a little hard to get is also, playing hard to get is also useful. No? So we have to see also now that the US and the West, EU, had come together and said they're going to invest some $600 billion as a counter to the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. They're talking about $600 billion promised over the next 3 years or so. But China in the last few years had invested more than 2 trillion already. So it's really a drop in the bucket compared. So we have to see where we can benefit, and the current government has had a very practical stance, maybe, even though the President Duterte attacked the West verbally, but actually he continued to welcome investments, continued to address issues, and continued to have interaction with the West. Although, as Professor Bobby said, we think that some of these agreements for mutual defense or so on needs to be revisited, because there are terms that are very, very one-sided. For instance, we are not allowed to even ask, and the Americans are not even expected to tell us when they're crisscrossing in our territory, when they go through their submarines, their ships. No, so the president, even the president of the Philippines, is not allowed to inspect the bases that they put inside our territories. So these things, and their citizens, regardless of what their violations are not going to be in our custody. They say it is in our jurisdiction, but they are not in our custody. All of them are always held by American custodies in our location, and we cannot. And the terms of their engagement are already. So these are things that we have to address to enhance. But it has been there's a lot of good outcomes from the independent foreign policy.
Anna, you're on mute. Anna, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Sir George. And I can surmise that all of you has a very nice, very productive point of view and perspective about the independent foreign policy of the previous administration and that of the President Duterte. So, but before I proceed to the next question, may I introduce my co-host for this webinar, Mr. Paul Gutierrez. He is actually the former president and the current secretary of the National Press Club. And probably Paul has a question. Paul, are you there?
Yeah.
Hi, Paul.
Yes.
Yes, Paul. Good afternoon. Sorry. And now you have a question, please. If you have a question, before I ask my second question. And actually, it's not my question. Questions are coming from different friends in Facebook, in YouTube, and also from our media friends. They sent us an advanced question, their advanced questions. But Paul, you have a question?
Yeah. Sorry. Sorry. I have to adjust my, Anyway, one of my questions is that how can the Philippines be really independent in its foreign policy when we look at the experience of President Duterte, where he is actually hemmed in on all sides by these American influence officials in the government. For example, I was actually surprised that President Marcos Jr. has even retained the services of our ambassador to Washington, Babsa Romualdez, who has been, shall we say, known to always follow the policy directives of the U.S. State Department. In the case of the EDCA being planned by President Duterte to be ended, I noticed that he is also under immense pressure, not only from our own Department of Foreign Affairs, but even from the military establishment for the continuation of EDCA. And even before President Duterte left office, there was this news that the hands of President Marcos Jr. has already been tied when the DND already agreed for over 300 military exercises with the United States this year alone. So my question particularly to Professor Steinbeck and Professor Bobby Tuazon is this still possible for President Marcos to uphold the independent foreign policy approach of President Duterte, considering all these factors that I mentioned?
Thank you, Paul. Yes, Dr. Dan, any comment?
It's a very complex and difficult question, and I don't have a simple answer to this. I think that the independence or independent foreign policy is always relative. There's no absolutely independent foreign policy. However, I share the concerns that we heard about. It is very hard to have a truly independent foreign policy if the voices that created a lot of noise, if we can use that term, during the previous administration retain their posts, or if like-minded, then occupy those posts. And I would like to also emphasize the point that some of the names that were mentioned are parallel to the kind of phenomena I've seen elsewhere in the US, but also here, and that is the privatization of conflicts. There is something, there's always an inherent moral hazard if you have former heads or board directors of US subsidiaries or European subsidiaries serving in the Philippine government. You wonder whose interests are being taken care of at first. I don't want to use names as an example because I think it's a generic problem. But I think that in this particular case, either it is simply the situation where it may perhaps take a while for the BBM administration to crystallize its independent foreign policy. It took a while for President Duterte as well. But you really can't have too many contradictions. And I think that what Professor Bobby said earlier, and Mr. Xie as well, I think we've come to a point where you have to make a clean break. Are you supporting geopolitics that will always serve the interests of the few? Or will you support economic development that will never serve the interests of all, but at least more, at least 40 to 70% of the nation? If we don't make very clear those principles, then the corollaries become a problem. If the principles are clear, then we will choose actors who we are sure will drive that policy in an optimal way. Right now, we are still in a no man's land, and it's not a good situation for an independent foreign policy, but I've seen worse ones. So I hope to be optimistic.
Thank you, Dr. Dan. Professor Bobby?
Yes, well, first of all, foreign policy is a national interest issue. It has been, it will always remain to be a national interest issue where you use foreign policy to promote the national interest of the Filipino people, ranging from sovereignty to territorial integrity to economic resources and other rights. Number two, foreign policy, no single person, not even a very powerful president, can manage foreign policy alone. Because to be able to transform foreign policy from a dependent one to an independent foreign policy, then you have to do something with regard the institutional gridlock, no, that is involved in foreign policy. Like you have to activate the oversight powers of Congress, and activating the oversight powers of Congress should include reviewing every year the foreign policy of the executive department, including all security and economic agreements. They have not done that, disappointingly.
Okay.
And
Thank
also, last point, it should be a national interest, something that should be that should heed and listen to the voices of the Filipino people, to the think tanks, to the NGOs, to the nationalist groups, to the patriotic organizations, even people from the military and other sectors. I think this should be a holistic approach. It should be a national approach.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Bobby. Now, there's a question coming from one of our friends from media, and it has something to do with the very much talked about and popularized so-called Sri Lanka debt trap. So I would address first the question to Mr. George C. Sir George, what do you think of this? Do you think it will happen to the Philippines, this so-called Sri Lankan debt trap? And what is really behind this? Is it really true that there's such a thing? This had been driven by the so-called Chinese loans, or this is just another propaganda against China? Can you give us a little bit of a background, and what do you think if there's a possibility that indeed this will happen in the Philippines? But of course, the other speaker can also butt in the discussion, especially on this particular issue. Thank you.
I think it's probably a mix of everything, and to point out that it's due to the Chinese debt trap is a total lack of perspective. But when we talk about loans and projects over a period of time, it's always subject to the approval, and in the Philippines, subject to the approval of NEDA, Department of Finance, etc., which our country, for the last several administrations, in fairness, whether opposition or what type of, we've had very good financial management by our people, and almost every term we get awarded the top central banker in the world or top monetary board officials. No, so in the course of this period, from having been a basket case in terms of finance, actually we have actually become one of the best managed finance countries in the world, such that our ratings in the Fitch agencies or other rating agencies have come to be possibly in the top 10. In fact, in 2019, the Philippines was in the top 10 in terms of debt to GDP ratio at only some 45%, against many of the major countries, including Japan, US, China, at 150 or over 200%. So even today, the deterioration due to the pandemic, it became 65%, is still quite healthy and possible for us to manage very well. So the projects is up to us. If they talk about the debt trap, they should also look at the projects that succeed. For some reason, some of these media, they point out to the projects, number one, they didn't fail in the manner that's described. For instance, the Sri Lankan situation, the Chinese loans are some 20% of the loans and 15% of the loans, whereas the Japanese and Western loans are over 85%. They also don't point out the successes like the Piraeus port, in which Greece was almost crushed by the financial restrictions of the EU, but the port that Italy had refused to take and was taken by Greece has become maybe the number 4 port in all of Europe. That's a Chinese investment and might become number 3 and possibly even higher than that in all of Europe. So there are also a lot of successes. And if we look at our Philippine situation, if we remember several things, number one, in the 80s, the Jobo bills, when we had a financial crisis, these were loans. We had the devaluation. Our interest rates went up to 45% from the central bank itself. That's under Jobo Fernandez, and this was imposed by the World Bank and the IMF, in which all their major projects failed in the Philippines. And then later it happened again during the Asian financial crisis, which is very much similar to now. There was a lot of flow of finance, easy money from the West, and then they suddenly drew it and caused the Asian financial crisis. And then again in 2008, when the same thing happened, the US released so much currency into the system, so much dollars into the system, and suddenly withdrew it. It caused a worldwide collapse. And these are all US-led. And why are they talking about a Chinese debt trap? And they're not talking about these things, that the US caused a worldwide financial crisis and actually bankrupted several countries. In fact, the current situation is several countries are on the verge of bankruptcy. And that's because the US, as pointed out by one of our speakers earlier, Mr. Powell, everybody knows he's personally competent, but maybe he couldn't stand the pressures from the administration. He allowed Trump to push him into continuing to release money when everybody was already saying it was already sufficient, it was not needed. But what happened is, not only did he keep releasing money, when Biden came in, he continued to release money, such that the original intent of releasing some $1.5 trillion ended up being releasing some between $4 and $5 trillion. You have to remember that China, over a period of some 40 years, with over 1 billion people working very hard, was able to accumulate maybe $2-3 trillion of reserves, of which 1.2 trillion they put in the US. And the US, in one flick of the switch, created $5 trillion released to the whole world. And now it's creating inflation because they released that money without increasing production. The production is coming from the rest of the world, so the goods become more and more expensive, not to mention the sanctions that the US is forcing the world to undertake. And so now they feel that this inflation might become a crisis in the US, and they're sucking out the money, causing devaluation in countries like the Philippines. We now have more than 10% devaluation. The European Union has 12% devaluation, not to mention inflation of goods. So these are caused by the US. So that means 10% of all our assets can be purchased at less than 10% the value it originally had towards the end of last year. And this is US imposing their currency manipulations on the rest of the world. When they're talking about Chinese currency manipulation, this last manipulation are the biggest ever in the history of the world, and it's not being pointed out. So, but we cannot complain because we're all dependent on this financial system. We just have to manage it. What we can say is we have very competent officials, and even this current administration, even the international bankers have indicated they're very satisfied with the election of the officials. Now we have to see how they actually act. It looks like that we will be able to weather this.
So can I add something, Anna?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, Sir George.
The question was on Sri Lanka.
Yes.
And where an economic collapse led to a political collapse, economic crisis to political crisis. It's about time that this issue about the debt trap should be set aside. Always blaming China, when in fact the debt trap of Sri Lanka was already indebted years and decades before China came in. The debt to China is only about 10 to 13%. And the rest of it, up to 70%, is to the IMF, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. These two global institutions are always the culprit behind the economic crisis in the developing world. So that's to correct this misinformation and to put into record that no country should be blamed on the economic collapse of course, Sri Lanka itself has its own internal implosion, internal reasons for, economic mismanagement, corruption, and so on and so forth. Good that the political crisis is giving way to a new set of officials. So let's see how they will be able to manage the whole situation.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Bobby, for that additional information and also clarification on this issue, because it's really like, been in many international media and it's always about China debt trap, So it's good to have such kind of clarification. Dr. Dan, do you have anything to say before I ask Paul if he has a question?
Oh, I would have a lot to say, but I will try to keep it to the minimum. It's a very important subject matter, and I couldn't have agreed more with the previous speakers. And while I say something, I wonder if Austin could take a slide that has to do with the cost of the overstretch that I would like to use. But prior to going to this, I just would like to remind us all that in the early period of the Duterte administration, there was this famous piece that came out in Forbes of all sources of all media, how the new Philippine debt of $167 billion could balloon to $452 billion, and China would benefit from this. This was an extraordinary statement, so I took a closer look at that, and it would have basically meant that within 5 years, the level of debt that was about 40% of the GDP at the time, I think, would have gone to the Japanese level or beyond. That's almost impossible. Now, substantially, it was a hoax. But here in the Philippines, it was portrayed in some media as something to be seriously taken. And for the best of me, it was very hard to understand why. So out of intrigue and out of, I think, petty sense of revenge, I wrote 2 or 3 columns of that debt and what had happened to it, first 2017, then 2019, and now. And of course, the situation is what we know. If there is an increase of the debt, that has a hell of a lot to do with the pandemic effect. Now, regarding the Sri Lanka situation, let's be real about this. They had an independence war, civil war that took decades, destroyed the country, devastated the infrastructure, created much resentment, caused so many losses in terms of economics, human lives. What we see now is the aftermath. And in that aftermath, naturally, those who want to destabilize further to get the leadership that they want like to portray the problems as a consequence of one actor rather than the other, in this particular case of China. This is disheartening for another reason. I said earlier that I think nowadays you really have to choose geopolitics or economic development. You can't have both. When Xi Jinping around 2013 came up with this idea of having new type of great power relations, many of my friends on the Chinese side were actually very excited. There was a certain sense of idealism. Perhaps for once in history, we could have a situation where we could work together, where we could cooperate. Now I'm afraid that the worst has happened. And I'm not talking about the amount of guns, weapons, or arms, or money, or funds. I'm talking about the loss of strategic trust. The strategic trust that used to exist bilaterally between the United States and China. When you lose it, it is terribly, terribly hard to restore it. And my last point on this matter is, if you look at the slide that Austin found, I would like to make note of the fact that this will hurt. This kind of situation where the geopolitics comes first prior to the economic development has hurt and will hurt most of the US economy. And by default, because of the great role of the US economy still in the world economy, many other countries will pay the bill, particularly those that are most vulnerable. But I don't think people understand how serious the situation is and how far it is. Just one example, the slide that you see, the level of debt in the US after the pandemic is at the level where it was after the war effort in World War II. And it is not stopping, it's not going down, it is soaring up. And that means that these deficits are projected to drive federal debt held by the public to unprecedented levels. We don't know what it means, to be honest, when they go so high. 2051, debt is projected to reach more than 200% of the GDP, US GDP. Congress does something. And there's only one thing that they can do, take more debt to pay for, and so on and so forth. As a result, the interest payments will go sky high in that situation. And it wouldn't matter otherwise. But let's factor in something else. The so-called post 9/11 wars, according to various estimates by American research universities, is about $8 trillion from 2001 to 2021. Imagine how that money could have been used in the US for infrastructure, for student debt, building affordable homes, and so on and so forth. It will never happen. The repercussions are huge in the US. And that's why you haven't had a thriving middle class in the country for such a long time. And that's why people like Sanders and others are finally being heard, and I think for the right reasons. And the unfortunate thing in this is the following. If you look at Sri Lanka, their debt level, public debt per GDP, is 101%. My understanding is the US level is now higher. So there are all kinds of elements in this situation why certain countries have to default, has to do with the dollar. Now look at the situation of the dollar then. It has, in relative terms, steadily deteriorated through the years. And imagine this, my last point. If the US level of debt per GDP is now at the level of that of Italy, as it is in the early 2010s, we know what happened to Italy in the few years after that. It wasn't very pretty. The difference is that the rest of the world, and even Italy, is no longer dependent on Italian lira, but we are dependent on the US dollar. So for the best of me, it is just hard to understand why we can't find a cooperative stance in terms of the Chinese objectives and the US objectives, and have a common denominator that's based on economic development. Any conflict that doesn't bring food on the table is a distraction. That's a Brechtian view, if you will, but I hold on to it.
Thank you, Dr. Dan, for again explaining the issue further and giving us more information and at least an enlightenment about this, because this issue is critical, I guess, because it's been confusing many Filipinos as well, especially the Sri Lankan debt trap being alluded as a Chinese debt trap. But before I ask my next question from the chat box, may I ask Paul if he has a question? Paul, are you there?
Sir Paul was called in for important media report. So I will be the one asking the questions taking place of Paul.
Okay, awesome.
Next question is from our Filipino scholar in Moscow. How do you assess Philippines-Russia relations and ASEAN-Russia relations? Can you give us some examples of how our neighbors are engaging with Russia, given the current developments? Thank you. To any of the experts.
Yeah, just before the experts can answer the question, let me ask another question related to that, which is now written in the chat box. This is the question: what do you think about the Philippine-Russia relationship? Do you think it would be wise to align our foreign policy towards Russia? So I think it's the question. The two questions are related, so our speakers can address them. So let's probably ask Professor Bobby first, then Dr. Dan, and then Mr. George C.
Excuse me. Alliance, no. We should not enter into any new alliance. We have had enough of that. No, so we cannot really build an independent foreign policy if you align yourself to any foreign power, be it China, the US, or even Russia. Now, with regard to the Russian-Philippine relations, President Duterte tried to reinvigorate Russian-Philippine relations. In fact, he went to Moscow to talk to Vladimir Putin himself. I think this was in 2017 or 2018. But the trouble is that particular step has not been complemented by other approaches, by other steps, by other measures. And so now we are in a situation where we really haven't built the institutional bridges that will normalize, stabilize, and make our relations with Moscow more robust. It's too far. Moscow is too far from the Philippines, although we have, of course, Filipino workers there, some OFWs, also some professionals. But it would be good, really. Russian oil is the cheapest in the world. We should not depend on American oil imports, not even from Middle East imports. We should also develop ties with Iran. Iran, for several decades, has been approaching the Philippines, saying, "Look, we have good energy. We can offer it to you for a lower price. Why don't you tap our energy?" So these are the opportunities that we have been missing, because our frame of mind has always been enhanced on the U.S. What the U.S. can offer, what the U.S. can give in terms of military assistance. So let us broaden. Let us broaden. Let us unbundle ourselves from being locked to century-old, subjugation to foreign powers.
Thank you, Professor Bobby. Dr. Dan, any comment?
Well, in the sense that, as I mentioned earlier, the situation in Ukraine is dire. It didn't have to happen. It's an unwarranted war. That's a term I've used to describe it. And we should remember what happened in Ukraine prior to the war, prior to the conflict. There was a strong effort by President Putin to be taken seriously with his demand that there should be a neutral area between Russia and Europe, and that this area was something that Soviet Union initially had agreed to, that there shouldn't be NATO's eastward expansion. And then the disillusionment with the West on the part of the Russians, it unfortunately undermined what was developing in Ukraine, which was a very intriguing scenario. China was investing a lot there. China was investing a lot in logistics, in trains, and so on and so forth. Actually, President Zelensky himself was actually congratulating China for this and wanted to portray his country, Ukraine, as a bridgehead to Europe, which was something that not everybody liked in the West. But imagine if that scenario had happened, where Ukraine would be a decade from now, and imagine where it will be a decade from now. It may be split, it may be fragmented, a lot of negative things may happen. When it comes to Philippine relationship with Ukraine, or ASEAN relationship with Russia, and so on and so forth, I think that particularly with Russia, their main export really is energy. And due to this unfortunate, unwarranted war, we are in a situation where Russian oil and gas is not very much liked in the West, and it's looking access elsewhere. Something that I've been very concerned for a very long time: how will emerging economies in the East ensure their relatively affordable energy supplies in the future? Well, because of this terrible plunder, because of this terrible policy mistake that we call the Ukraine conflict, it may be possible in ways that Professor Bob already alluded to. That's one thing. The other thing is that Russia, as well as Iran, that Professor Bobby alluded to as well, they understand very well the importance of multipolar world economy. And as I said, you can't have both. You can't have geopolitics and economic development. And if you have exceptionalism, be that American exceptionalism or Chinese exceptionalism or British exceptionalism or whatever it might be, it doesn't fit the world as it is today. We have to be able to find globally interdependent ways of maneuvering. And I think that Philippines is in a situation where if it wants to conduct independent foreign policy, it may no longer be enough to look at things and be a bystander. by saying that I think Philippines could be more active, I mean particularly ASEAN and the voice that ASEAN has. I think it may be greater than people think. Just because it hasn't been used forcefully in the past doesn't mean that it won't be important in the future. This is now the most dynamic region in the world and could be so if geopolitics stays away.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Dan. Okay.
And yes,
Yes,
if I
yes, sir,
could
George.
give a few cents worth.
Yes, sir.
There are many indications that we are still in the grip of either our own thinking that we have to be purist in the way we approach things, or are we still very much under the control of the US? If we will note during the recent events of the Russia-Ukraine, the President Duterte had said that we should not be siding with anybody. But our DFA Secretary Locsin actually came out and critiqued, among all of ASEAN, we're the only one that critiqued Russia for this event. We're not saying we should side with Russia, but it's really not our fight. No? And we have to remember that during the oil crisis of some decades ago, Iran, and actually Libya helped us by giving us a very concessionary oil supply. And now we are also not accepting these possible trades. I haven't gone through the cost of logistics, but simply for us to say that Russia is charging some $40 less, and they're offering that also to the Philippines. It's being bought up to some point in time. Japan was buying, even the US was buying, EU was buying. India is buying 25 times more oil and gas today than they used to buy. And the US is continuing to have that relationship with India because they need them. So why are we not considering this? No, we're not only talking about oil. We have to talk about food because there's an impending food crisis that's already developing. The stock supplies of wheat, which is a major, it's in from 60, 70, up to 80% of all food products, no, including soy sauce, including other things, not just bread and pastries and pasta. It is such an important part of the food supply. In many countries, they're going to run out already. And even in the Philippines, within a month or two, the pandesal is expected to double in price. And we have to address this. And whether we address it by opening our trading philosophies or having alternatives, it's something we have to address. And we have to note that other countries, successful developed countries, are open. They understand that even if you have a dispute, you can still deal very effectively. So Japan, even though it has this very hot dispute with China, even Premier Abe had gone to visit China and invited and talked very actively about trade and investments. And Vietnam, which has a very active dispute with China, in fact, after they had attacks on some Chinese factories some years ago, within 2 months, the head of Vietnam, the president of Vietnam, went to China with 200 top business people. And because of that, in the following years, they had some $7-8 billion worth of manufacturing investments from China. And that's what created, because when you have investment, there tends to be a cluster effect like a mall or restaurant. When you have a chain, more tend to come in. So when these investments came in, Samsung alone put in $17 billion. They pledged $17 billion, in which they've already put in the $7 billion investment for a major manufacturing there. The same when some of the Chinese investments came in and expanded the market. The Philippines investment, even from the US, even from EU, multiplied. So we can say, for instance, even though the US is telling its people to ban investments and interaction with China, last year, the investments from the US to China has been at the record levels, as well as the trade. In fact, they need it so much. Currently, the US is having to go to China because of their inflation to ask for, while they're having a trade war, ask for more goods to be allowed to be imported. But to save face, they're asking China to drop their tariffs because the US is wanting to drop their tariffs. China is playing a little hardball and saying, it's your fault, up to you if you want to drop the tariffs. We might not, or we might drop tariffs. No? So, I mean, we have to be practical. On one hand, we could have a fight. On the other hand, we can continue to do good business good people interaction together.
Thank you, Sir George. Thank you as well, Dr. Dan and Professor Bobby, for responding to this very sensitive, I think, and also highly political question on the Ukraine crisis, and also on having relations with China, Russia, and the rest, even vis-a-vis the United States. But before I ask the next question that was posted in our chat box, our expert wished to show a video about, basically this is about Ukraine-Russia conflict, that would give us a little bit of enlightenment more, no? But this is just a short video clip, I think. Austin, do you have the video?
Yes. By the way, just to add, no, that question came from JP Prado, who's our scholar again in Moscow University. And part of our IDC series is we'll be interviewing our Filipinos abroad, no, who are excelling in some of the top universities. He also has a lot of stories. I just found out there's about 100 or so Filipinos who are studying in Russia. So they have really interesting insights also that I'm sure we can learn from. At the same time, IDC's pride itself on going direct to the sources. So we have a good friend here who actually warned of the Russian-Ukraine conflict back in 1997 when he was still a senator. So I'm going to share the screen now. Can everyone see the video?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to play it.
I think the one place where the greatest consternation would be caused in the short term for admission would be to admit the Baltic states now in terms of NATO-Russian, US-Russian relations. And if there was ever anything that was going to tip the balance, were it to be tipped in terms of a vigorous and hostile reaction, I don't mean military, in Russia, it would be that.
This is from American blogger. So we also want to recognize our sources. Many of our sources come directly from our friends in the US. And we'll make this available as well. On the next video is former US, the next video, former US Senator John McCain in Kiev, Ukraine, egging the Ukrainians to protest and against their democratically elected president. This is Maidan Square. I believe Professor Bobby Tuazon and Dr. Dan Steinbock have written about this as well.
Ukraine. People of Ukraine, this is your moment.
Народи українські, це ваш момент.
This is about you, no one else.
Це про вас.
This is about the future you want for your country. This is about the future you deserve.
Це про ваше майбутнє, про майбутнє вашої країни. Це про майбутнє, на яке ви заслуговуєте.
A future in Europe.
Майбутнє Європи.
A future of peace. And good
Майбутнє миру.
relations with all of your neighbors.
Майбутнє всіх ваших сусідів.
The free world is with you. America is with you. I am with you. And the destiny you seek lies in Europe.
All right. So
Okay,
Yes,
thank
Austin.
you.
we will share these links. George, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I think that's a tribute to the vigorousness and dynamism also of the American system, whereas there's all these attempts to cover up. It's also very dynamic in the sense that some of these honest people, honest Americans are still trying to give some balance to informations. So we got this actually from American sources as well. But it's not only McCain. We should point out that Hillary was also out there giving out benefits and candies and cookies and other things to the protesters. So what is the US always protesting about interference in their elections? You can see right there, the vice presidents, the senators, the leaders of the legislature going around the world promoting this, not only in Russia, but in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and to some extent even here in the Philippines. No? So we're pointing out that there is all this interference coming from the US.
Okay, thank you, Sir George. Okay, let me read the question coming from read the question from Chino Gaston from GMA7. No, earlier this morning there was a webinar with the theme redefining maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. In an age of uncertainty. That's the theme of the strat-based webinar this morning. And his question is, may I get the panel's opinion on the promise of Marcos administration to uphold the 2016 Arbitral Award, but still engage with China in terms of economic projects? Yet AFP, or the Armed Forces of the Philippines, is bolstering its external defense capabilities to offer deterrence at the same time. And also with in relation to this question, may I also add, what do you think of the so-called being propagated by even certain personalities in this country that there's such a thing as an impending China threat? That's why there's a need for the AFP to modernize, and also there's a need for the so-called ROTC. I think this question of Chino and my questions are very much related, and to a certain extent, I think this was discussed earlier in the strat-based webinar. So, what do you think, experts of geopolitics, Professor Bobby, and also Dr. Dan? What can you say about this? What's your perspective on this?
May I know what the threat is coming from? Where is it coming from?
There is this so-called discussion at the moment with certain political personalities, or personalities for that matter, that there's such a thing as an impending threat, impending threat from China. I think it talks about military.
Well, if China wanted really to threaten the Philippines, it should have done that years back and taken over the Philippines. I'm sorry to say. Let's look at it more positively. Right now, I would like to suggest to the policymakers of the Marcos administration to reinvigorate the bilateral dialogue mechanisms between China and the Philippines that was established between the Duterte government and Xi Jinping way back in 2017 to resolve all pending bilateral conflicts, including the South China Sea and so on and so forth. But then again, just 1 or 2 weeks ago, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, came to the Philippines, and both Wang Yi and President Marcos agreed that the South China Sea issue is not the sum total of Philippine-China relations. We have other matters to deal with, like trade, economic cooperation, people-to-people, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Let not the South China Sea be the stumbling block to possible opportunities of cooperation under the new administration. I'd rather look at it. Well, historically, I can say right now that, in fact, China since 1949 has been able to resolve 24 of its 27 territorial disputes peacefully without resorting to any military action. And the objective of those negotiations were to really to come up with a treaty of non-aggression and a peace agreement. So that's why I say that let us be more productive, more constructive, and use the available mechanisms that are there. It's unfortunate that Philippine ambassador to China, Chito Santa Romana, who did his best to use these mechanisms, passed away last April, and there's no new ambassador has been appointed to Beijing.
Yes, thank you, Professor Bobby. Dr. Dan, what's your opinion on this? That the Marcos administration is to uphold 2016 Arbitral Award, but still engage with China in terms of economic project, and the AFP is intensifying or trying to modernize our defense capabilities to offer deterrence at the same time. But usually some personalities would refer to that deterrence, and the object of that deterrence is the so-called impending threat from China. So what's your reaction to this? And what's your perspective? Is there some truth to it that, there's such a thing as a China threat to the vis-a-vis the Philippines?
If I can ask Austin to take back the slide on the independent foreign policy in the Philippines, I think that threat picture has been exaggerated almost out of extinction here. I think it's very unfortunate and potentially worrisome in that it is almost as if the previous administration, and I do not mean the Duterte administration, but the Aquino administration, which made the deals, for instance, with these pogos and these gamers to come to Philippines, and gave basically an illicit industry in China, free room to maneuver, something that President Duterte was against, but there was a very difficult situation in the early days of the pandemic, so that was allowed. Sometimes I can't help but wonder, why would you make a deal with this kind of an industry at that kind of a time, when there's so much talk about arbitration and the use of that decision? Unless, of course, you want to have a scapegoat, a physical face, a target that you can point out to people and say that they are the reason for your misery. They are the reason for your economic malaise. They are because we are being held back. We saw what happened with this kind of sentiments in the early days of the pandemic. You had an explosion of hate crimes against the Chinese in the United States and somewhat also in Europe. And they didn't stop at that. There were spillovers against all Asians. It reminded me of the terrible days after 9/11, when Indian immigrants, Sikhs, were attacked because people thought that they were possibly Osama bin Laden. Or when a friend of mine, who was the Finnish ambassador, wanted to enter the United States, and his name in Finnish is Osmo. The immigration official thought, this is dangerously close to Osama. Let's have an investigation. When people exaggerate these kind of threats, only bad things will ensue. And I think that the slide I offered earlier about the independent foreign policy is relevant. Where does this picture of threat come from? It comes from the images that are being maneuvered by a number of think tanks. They would say that, well, it's just one contingency, it's one scenario. But why then market this scenario on, if not primetime TV, a major political news in the US, NBC News? And why use year 2027 creating an impression that there's an impending threat and it will take place 2027, especially taking into consideration the fact that that year came from an admiral who was American, and who actually had betrayed his own commanding officers by taking a ship out when he was warned not to do so because of the coronavirus. As a result, 600 Americans caught it and 102 died. So I, being a little bit cynical, I'm wondering, was this his way of shaping his own legacy, using this 2027 point as a platform to give congressional testimony when he was not interrogated about his conduct during the pandemic crisis, but his foresight for ASEAN, for Philippines, and so on and so forth? I think that ultimately you simply have to choose. You have to choose between economic development or geopolitics. And if we take that road to geopolitics, at the furthest end of it, we might find ourselves in the situation where some powers will fight with the Philippines to the last Filipino. But that's not necessarily what the Filipinos want. And that's why I think it's so important to concentrate on economic development. Austin found a slide, I won't spend time on this, but that's about Taiwan, but perhaps it's relevant as well. This was a so-called Project 24/9 Institute that was created in the US. The key player in it was Richard Armitage, who had a great role in Iran-Contra debacle in 1980s, a very controversial character. Again, you have the same sponsors, the big defense contractors, and then you have a bunch of other organizations, including Bother Group Asia, which is connected with the ADRI in the Philippines, Open Society National Endowment for Democracy, in whose name also Mr. McCain presented himself in Ukraine, 2014. So this path to where we are now has been plotted quite a long while ago. And the objective has been to prevent perhaps the rise of China in this case. And I, for the best of me, don't understand why you can't have both. You can have the rise of China economically. They have very little interest in military. If you look at the military expenditures in China and US and Europe, you will find out that on per capita basis, US is 20 times more, Europe maybe 10 times more. But they are willing to defend what they have achieved, which is only understandable. So that's the one thing we should do whatever we can to avoid the option or the scenario of geopolitics that would surpass the economic objectives. And I don't think that Philippines can afford it.
Thank you, Dr. Dan. But before I move on to the next question in the chat box, let me have a follow-up question for you, Dr. Dan.
Anna, can I give a little input here?
Okay,
Yeah.
sir. Before my follow-up question to Dr. Dan, let me call on Sir George
yes,
to have an input on the question.
We can look at, since we're talking about BBM Marcos, his father was a master of the dance. Let's call that. Why do I say this as regards to China? You know, if we remember, Marcos opened the relations with China even before the US did, right? So on one hand, he was opening his arms to China, and not only with China but also with Russia and with Libya and so on. On the other hand, he's the first to put in our laws a claim on the sprat lease. No, in 1978, he put two laws for the economic zones and for the territory. So on one hand, it's like dancing with somebody, and on the other hand, you're pickpocketing, right? And we had perfectly good relations. So that's a true diplomat and a true politician. And we had excellent relations with China at that time. So second, for what reason would China be interested in invading the Philippines? There is no interest in invasion of the Philippines, but the Philippines may become a target for different reasons. Why is there no interest in the Philippines? Because if we look at the entire Philippine, if we look at it from an economic basis, the entire Philippine productive capacity, about $370 billion GDP a year, no, is less than 1/2 of 1 year's growth. Because China's growth at 6% of a $14 trillion economy, 13, 14 trillion, we're talking about $800 billion a year growth. $800 billion a year growth. So our entire economy is sunk into just 1/2 of a year's growth. For what reason would they risk their entire reputation and have to go through war to take over the Philippines? But there is a reason to possibly attack and invade the Philippines is actually defensive rather than offensive. If we remember, they did not start building on those islands the military capability until the Philippines started saying publicly, very publicly, that they would invite the US to come in and defend those territories against China. Now, it makes it impossible for China politicians not to react to that, because their people will say, you are going to allow the US to come in and tighten the noose around us, because the US has already stated that its objective is to keep tightening the ring around China. And so if we have 6 EDCA bases here and negotiating for more, and now there are all these missiles, they have to get at those missiles and attack before they reach maximum velocity. So anyone who understands military will understand that. So they have to be there, whereas they were not there before. If the US is saying that they did not protest before, that is not the case. They have been sending letters and representations and were being ignored by the US and the West, just the same as the Russian proposal to just consider mutuality of security was totally ignored by the US and the EU. Why don't you just agenda it and put it on record? They refused. No, so that is we have to see. In fact, the OSCE, the Organization for Security of Europe, European Community, has agreed in principle many years ago that you cannot enhance the security of one party without considering mutual security of all the parties. And that is what they did. So we have to understand that today, especially for powers, you cannot try to enhance your security at my expense. They will react. In fact, this is also the US policy. They are disallowing, in fact, they've sanctioned Cuba, who is totally no threat to the US for how many decades and crushed the economy of Cuba. And they're trying to do that to Venezuela, but they're not allowing any other country to recognize. In fact, China's stated by Bobby, the resolutions they had on the majority of their territorial disputes, you know, depending on the statistics, 17 out of 23 or 23 out of 27, the majority of them have been giving a more favorable terms to the third party. So right now, there was an agreement in principle that we will take the do the development of the resources in the South China Sea together, and the US and the Western companies were giving the Philippines only 10% of the benefit, and we're not paying taxes on it. And China was willing to give 60%, and that 60% presumably already covers taxes. But when it came to Locsin DFA, then he insisted that they have to recognize our sovereignty. The effect, we were supposed, from the beginning, the agreement was not to discuss sovereignty and just benefit from it together. So there are all these issues. So these are what we need to strengthen our defense. Yes, we could be a target, but not because they want to invade us, but because they need to defend themselves against this tightening ring. And we should strengthen our defense, not just against China, but for all purposes about protecting our economic as well as political issues from all parties. Why are we not talking about Sabah, which is actual territory with all these borders and around the territorial seas, 10 producing oil wells, gold, tin, mining, forestry, and then we're going to fight over water. So this is just to put in perspective this issue about, they keep saying China will attack the Philippines. There's, you know, they have to point out what's the basis, no? And how this can be managed. In fact, China had given up over 1 million square kilometers or miles of territory of Mongolia just to give a buffer zone between Russia and China, and they're respecting it.
Yeah, I think thank you to all our speakers for responding extensively to that question. I think that question is very important, no? Especially to clarify the issue that there's such a thing as an impending threat coming from the Chinese, and it's being used to justify certain. I think I read one article. One senator of the country is speaking about this. I think this is very important issue, that such webinar is important, you know, to clarify and to educate our public. And my follow-up question, before I read the question posted in the chat box, I have a follow-up question for Dr. Dan. And I think the other speaker can also chime in. My follow-up question is this, no? And it's very much related to the ongoing discussion. The U.S. Center for National Security, it is Biden's, no, President Biden's key think tank, launched a recent report on revitalizing the U.S.-Philippine alliance. It openly seeks to sustain U.S. primacy in the region. When I'm talking about the region, it basically includes the Southeast Asian region, and also, of course, the bigger Indo-Pacific region, or what you call the Asia-Pacific region. How should the Philippines read this, and what should be the attitude of the new government or under the presidency of Marcos Jr.? What should be the attitude of the Philippines with regard to this? And also, I would just also add an additional question. Since Sir George mentioned the oil and gas joint exploration, what do you think of this? Would the next administration take on this and continue to explore possible oil and gas joint exploration in the Reed Bank, or would we just forget about it? So any reaction? Of course, I will ask first Dr. Dan, since this is basically a follow-up question to your discussion earlier, and then Professor Bobby, and of course Sir George, because I've mentioned the oil and gas and joint exploration. Yes, sir.
Yes, you managed to ask very big questions in a very concise way. I will try to answer very briefly in that regard. When it comes to the notion of oil explorations, my understanding is that there is a very strong eagerness on the Chinese side to continue the talks. So it's the end of one administration is not the end of the second administration, it's the beginning of one. So this also allows you to have a clean slate. But I think that there's also a very clear understanding that the objective of the new government is to build on the legacy of the Duterte government. And the fact that the Chinese side is very eager to continue signifies or signals that they are eager also to have some sort of resolution. And perhaps now, as we have bypassing the pandemic period, which was a great distraction and terrible economic and human loss, there's more time to focus on this. I think that it's, in the long run, it is the only way to go. And I think that it is the only way to create economic basis to a security arrangement, if you will. I'm also encouraged in this regard by the choice of Clarita Carlos to be a security advisor. Not just her personality, which is very well known here in the Philippines, but her approach. The idea that security is multidimensional, that it is based on physical security, it's based on well-being, it's based on quite a few other things. And the willingness and a signaling by the Marcos administration to take that path by making note of the fact that, well, there's nothing wrong about having more people exchanges. And actually, we should have more exchanging involving the academic side, which is something that the Vice President Duterte has already made very clear. And why not focus on technology? There was a time already in the Aquino era where Chinese companies were actively looking for destination points to outsource and offshore. And purely for geopolitical reasons, I think a lot of plans fell apart. This was a loss, I think, to both sides in the long run, but it doesn't have to be an internal loss. You can now build on this new approach to find a very different reality. As to the Indo-Pacific, I think that, well, it has often been mentioned as a kind of a counterpoint to the new Silk Road. Let's be real about these things. When the Marshall Plan was created in 1949 and it lasted about 4 years, it was around $130 million, if I'm not mistaken, which today would be 10, 15 billions, something of that nature. When we're talking about this new Silk Road, we're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar plan that goes for quite a long time. That plan has been attacked, and sometimes there are people who are critical because things go wrong. Sometimes because people are ideological and don't just accept the plan. And I'm afraid that it has been the latter that has been paramount. Recent studies, if I recall, in US and UK, major research universities have shown that the exaggerated threat of debt is not paramount with this operation. There's a lot to be learned. And again, if we would have more cooperation with the Americans and the Europeans and the Japanese who've had this experience over time, and the Europeans have been more willing, and the Japanese, but not the Americans. And as long as Americans are not willing, it's harder to pay footsie in that regard. I think a lot more could be achieved. But Indo-Pacific, unfortunately, seems to me to be more a geopolitical plan than economic plan. It looks into cooperation with the Quad. It talks a lot about AUKUS. As I mentioned before, it is willing to partner with India, but it doesn't really want to deal with Indian trade issues regarding the US or Europe. It just wants to have India's back in the region. And then there's the unfortunate fact that when the former Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Pompeo, presented the Indo-Pacific plan for the first time, he managed in the matter of 10 to 20 minutes to misread the entire history of Southeast Asia in forgetting all the negative things that make it pretty hard for people in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and even in Philippines, not to mention China and Korea, to take very seriously this kind of plans. It also reminded me of the fact that, as much as we've seen happening in terms of South Korea and North Korea, in terms of efforts to rapprochement, détente, and so on and so forth, there's no peace agreement. No, so you start wondering, it's 70 years has passed and there's absolutely no peace agreement. Is this because there's no peace agreement or because people don't want to have a peace agreement? In the latter case, rule and divide, the old colonial principle seems to apply. So my concern with the Indo-Pacific is that irrespective of the intentions of some who have been formulating it and others who want to join it and think that they can hedge their bets, it won't work that way. It's a geopolitical plan. Its ultimate objective is security, and security at the expense of one or two other actors. And I think that the only way you can develop this region is by cooperation. And I think ASEAN can be a key player in that. Old-time veteran statesmen such as Mahathir and others and their voices about Indo-Pacific, what it is, what it says it is, and what it can do and what it won't do to ASEAN, I think are of paramount importance right now. And one more thing, if I may.
Yes, sir.
Austin keeps showing that slide, so I feel compelled to say something about it. It's a simple slide in the sense that who profits when geopolitics rules? It's always the defense contractors. Their profits have gone sky high. Here's the headline from Investors Business Daily, March 9. That was a long time ago. Russia's war on Ukraine makes defense investors $49 billion richer. Unfortunately, it happens at the expense of the people who become targets. And that's why the independence of foreign policy is so very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. Yes. Any further comments coming from Professor Bobby and Sir George? Before
Yes,
I ask Austin, because Austin has a question.
Yes, by all means, the project for a joint exploration and development of the South China Sea marine resources should push on. It's an old idea, actually. It's an old project. We heard it first during the Ramos administration. This joint exploration with the Chinese had already offered the 60-40 ratio with regards to the development, the fruits of development. So we should pursue that. And whenever nations like China and the Philippines enter into some kind of a development scheme, no country should interfere. Because some countries want to interfere with political objectives in mind. So they want to derail whatever cooperation is developing between China and the Philippines. Now, with regard to the Indo-Pacific strategy, well, it dates way back during the time of Obama's pivot to Asia. And since then, Obama's pivot to Asia has expanded to become today, I think it came up first during the Trump administration, into the Indo-Pacific strategy, where the key person is Kurt Campbell. He's the key person there. But the objective there is to tighten an alliance, a strategy against China. And before it even started, this Indo-Pacific strategy is already divided. India is being cajoled to join, but I don't think India is interested. And other countries are not joining it either. I think, I don't know whether the Americans are realistic enough to be aware of the fact that Asians don't want war. We want peace here. This is the 21st Asian century. This is the century of Asia, where we had before, 200 years ago, before the colonizers engulfed our territories and made us slaves for their colonial pursuits. You know? It won't work. The Indo-Pacific strategy will not work. I'm absolutely sure about that.
I'd like to put in a position, not a position, but a reminder that like all other negotiations or positioning, timing is important. So if we keep refusing and keep on not entering this situation. It would have been different if we had entered into agreement earlier. It's different if we enter agreement today. It's different if we enter agreement at a time in the future when the chips and the positions have changed. We have to remember, we also have to look at which country we're dealing with. That means that, like people in politics or in business here, if you were friends, if you were good friends at the time here when you were in school and everybody was a nobody, it's different from when they've already attained a level of power and success. And we have to see also which countries or which cultures take this into account. We have to remember Russia remembers relationships, no? And we remember China remembers relationships. Why do I say this? For instance, our hybrid rice, the technology was given to the Philippines by Professor Yuen Longpin, which has increased by several million tons a year in production. For the Philippines, it was given for free. There is a charge because someone who took the license took it and they have to adapt it to Philippine conditions. And so they charge something for that. But the seed technology was given to the Philippines for free. If people don't know, it was stated by Yuen Longping because they remembered that some 300-400 years ago or 200 years ago, when there was a famine in Fujian, it was the Philippine kamote which was introduced to Fujian that saved a lot of the people's lives. So this is a way of paying back. We know certain cultures take this into account. If we look at, I don't mean because a lot of Americans are different, but if we look at the American government, you know, Saddam Hussein was their boy and they hanged him. Gaddafi was their boy and they had him given to be murdered in the most cruel way, you know, and so on and so forth, all over South America and Middle East. And maybe perhaps we could look at also the situation in the Philippines, who they supported and turned on against. So we have to look at it. Timing is also important.
Recording stopped.
Um,
Recording in progress.
Thank you, Sir George. Just before I give the floor to Austin, I just want to read one comment in the chat box, which is very, I think, affirmed to a certain extent the stand and perspective of our speakers. This is from Tempo YT. The armed forces capability is nothing compared to China, but they are necessary to secure our shores, not only from China, but from other encroachers as well. Its capability development has nothing to do with China threat. With or without China threat, our defenses should be strong enough for contingency, including natural disasters. I don't believe AFP is using that scenario to ask for more budget for defense. It is basic for national security survival, basic for any shift in foreign policy in the future, which is, yeah, personally, I would agree to that we should modernize our AFP, not necessarily because of for any what you call impending threat coming from China being propagated by certain personalities, but for our own national security. I guess that's the basic message of Mr. Tempo or Miss Tempo YT. Anyway, Austin, you take the floor if you have a question, please.
Yes, as per Anna, I just want to bring up that, you know, since you brought up the AFP, we have seen in the last several years that even the international community, no one has complained about any significant violations of human rights.
Yes.
Against the original position from the international media that when Duterte came in, they would be doing all these crimes and violations left and right. Today, no one is pointing that out from the military, and they've been very helpful during the calamities and other frontliners in the rescue operations and we congratulate them for that, and also for the honest media who have been trying to help propagate these alternative views.
Thank you, Sir George. Austin, do you have a question?
Yes, Mr. George. We have a challenge. You don't have to believe any of our experts because we will bring you direct to the source. Another of our American friends. This one actually was a former media person who went and started his own vlog on YouTube. And we're Clayton Morris. We're going to share a video where he found one of the CEOs of the military companies in the US admitting that they are making billions more from the Ukraine war. So without further ado, I'm going to play that video.
Command Shift 3.
It's the fog of war, they say. Well, how convenient, right? But that's okay, because they will be replenished with more taxpayer dollars, continuing this virtuous circle of making money. And last week, the CEO of Raytheon, Greg Hayes, admitted that most of the weapons at the Department of Defense are simply stockpiles and will need to be replenished, which of course is excellent for business, as he expects profits to go up thanks to war. Here is Greg Hayes, the CEO of Raytheon, telling us why he doesn't make a mistake. He doesn't feel badly about this at all. This is just the business of war.
Apology for that. I think, again, recognizing, we are there to defend democracy. And the fact is, eventually, we will see some benefit in the business over time. Everything that's being shipped into Ukraine today, of course, is coming out of stockpiles, either at DOD or from our NATO allies. And that's all great news. Eventually, we'll have to replenish it, and we will see a benefit to the business over the next coming years.
It's all great news. Way to go.
Actually, there's an update to that. The U.S. has decided to ship HIMARS. HIMARS, this is a modern advanced rocket missiles that can reach their targets by 300 kilometers. And they're ready to ship thousands of these missiles. But I think the Russians have their own effective defense system to be able to counteract. So they keep on fueling this fire already raging in Ukraine. Of course, the main intention there is war for profits at the cost of the lives of the Ukrainian people themselves.
Thank you, Professor Bobby. We are already on our second hour, and we still have 80% of our audience. That means we're really are on a hot button topics. We have a few more media questions. They might have to leave soon, so I'll just prioritize them, and then we'll go back to the more sensationalized discussion and topics. The question from the media is, what is your projection, Dr. Dan, from the global viewpoint on the rising energy and food prices? And Professor Bobby and Professor George, how do you see the Philippines, and how should Filipinos prepare? Also with President Bongbong Marcos taking the Department of Agriculture. Yes, can you give us some projections and some recommendations on the individual level? How should we prepare? Thank you.
Well, I think that the problem with the energy and food crisis is that they're not going to go anywhere very soon. If you look at the some indicators for the commodity index, it's not the highest where it was around February, March, but it's elevated. Food index, the same story. Oil, the same, and can change very rapidly if things get worse. EU natural gas is actually higher than where it was in March. And I'm afraid, as I mentioned earlier, that the role of the fuel and the food in the baskets, price inflation basket, particularly in Southeast Asia, is significantly higher, which is normal for the level of economic development than in the European Union or Japan or US. So the bill will be harder to carry. The pain will be more widespread. And what may complicate it even further is that the Fed will continue its rate increases. It has to, because it was so late a while ago, it is now rushing. And since it's planning to have quantitative tightening at the same time, this will inevitably affect Southeast Asia. It has already affected the peso quite significantly, even in relative to other Southeast Asian currencies. And the war, if there was a dedicated will, very strong will to end it, that would be one thing. But it seems to be the case that in the proxy war, there are players who want it to linger. certainly defense contractors, one of whom spoke a moment ago, would like to have it that way. It's good for business, but it's terrible for human lives. So I think that these crises won't go away anytime soon, as unfortunate as it is.
Okay. Sir George, Sir Bobby.
Yeah, well, my quick response to that is that uh, way before the Ukraine crisis, we have been facing such economic hardships. Inflation, increasing prices of oil products, and so on and so forth. So we cannot entirely, it is, I think, wrong to attribute whatever economic hardships we're now facing to blame it to the Ukraine crisis. And just as I said earlier, it's about time that we need to reorient our economic strategy, diversify our sources of oil, like tapping the Russian oil, and so on and so forth. I mean, turning this crisis into opportunities for the economy.
Thank you, Professor Bobby. Sir George,
Yes.
do you have something to say?
Yes.
Mhm.
First of all, I think very often it is the situation now is blamed on the Ukraine war. Actually, it's a very limited war from a physical basis. It's a world war from a political basis because the US is forcing the whole world to take action against Russia. But it's really this inflation and this instability is really mostly due to the US because the exports of energy, oil, and foodstuffs are not really very highly restricted. Even from Russia, even from Ukraine, Russia is allowing them to export these goods, but Zelensky has put a ban on it because he wants more weapons from the US. And then there are other issues involved, right? So also the terms of in terms of currency and clearing systems, and the US has made everything involved here. In our situation here in the Philippines, we have about $34 billion of OFW. They will benefit from the devaluation. The outsourcing industry will benefit. That's about $28 billion out of our $370 billion economy. Our service economy from tourism is not yet going to benefit until the foreign tourists come in. We have the export industry, a few tens of billions of dollars. So we're talking about something close to $100 billion that will benefit out of some $380 billion. So it's not bad for everybody, but it's going to be bad for the working class, middle class, because as Dr. Steinbock pointed out, as a percent of the income, these basic items are going to be very essential to them, and they have to spend on these items. So there are things that we can do. For instance, the speeding up our digitization so people can do more work from home, so that they need to travel less, so that logistics is more efficient, so government payments can be done through the internet. And so there are these things we can do. Also, I think, as Austin here suggests and others, we have so many media people. Let's focus not just on the negatives and politics. If we focus more our stories, if people have traveled to Hong Kong, to South Korea, to Japan, you will find out even in China, the majority of the news are mostly about business. The major dailies, it's 70-80% business, but in the Philippines, it's 70-80% politics. That people like to talk about it even if they can't do anything about it. So productivity is important. We're spending the increased digitization. The statistics is showing Philippines is spending most of their time. Most people are spending 80-90% of the digitization watching Netflix, doing Facebook. Let's get into a more productive mode so that we can distribute the income more.
Yes, thank you, Sir George.
Since we passed the 2-hour mark, we'll do a short commercial break. We have our Filipino scholar in Moscow. He just finished his classes. He's doing some academic consulting also in Moscow. So if you can share how things are there, also for our media friends. Paulo, are you there? JP?
Yeah, I think so.
I have to unmute you. Go ahead. You're unmuted.
Hi, yes, I'm here. Yes, I'm here.
Professor Prado, yes, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to just make some comments with regards to what is happening here right now in Russia and in Ukraine, and especially with recent economic developments that Russia has been making with in terms of its currency and its rubles and its economy. So yes, like right now, I think that most of the U.S. economic sanctions has been backfiring against themselves. And I guess with these economic sanctions that has been imposed upon the Russian Federation, a lot of these sanctions have been beneficial to the country. Say, for example, the sanctions on the non-use and the non-proliferation of Russian gas. This caused a lot of price hikes in terms of, say, for example, like Europe and the United States, and also in the Philippines. So we have been seeing a lot of gas price hikes around the world because of these sanctions. Of course, these supplies, Russia supplies most of or a lot of oil and gas in the world market. And with this lack of supply, it will inevitably cause price hikes. So I think a more neutral approach to our foreign policy would be better for the Philippines. And I think also most of the food supplies and fertilizer supplies are coming from Russia. And these are also being sanctioned at the moment. And Russia is being painted with a very bad picture right now. So me coming from here in Moscow, I can really see how the situation is going. I can really assess that the situation right now is not benefiting the Philippines. So I guess the new administration, the Marcos presidency, should look into more neutral approach to its foreign policy.
On a personal question, Professor Prado, yes. He asked, how's our OFWs, our Filipinos doing there? Around how many are you? Mga ilan tayo dyan?
Around, I did another recount. Siguro, we're around 6,000 Filipinos here, but most are foreign workers. Very few students are studying here in Moscow.
Thank you. Everyone is safe. And I hope to see you
Everyone
soon.
is safe. Everyone is safe. Moscow is one of the safest places in Russia, and I guess with everything that's being implemented in the military operations in Ukraine, Muscovites and Russians are not in threat or are in not of any impending threat.
Please invite them during their winter. You can bring them to Boracay. I will make sure to give them a good tour.
Yes, I will.
Thank you. All right. See you soon.
Thank you.
Professor Ana, back to you. Maybe one or two more questions, and our experts also have to proceed to their next appointments. Thank you once again to our media friends, our government, and our academic friends. For those who we cannot answer your questions, please email them, and we will make sure to send them to the experts for their answers. We will send by email. Go ahead. Professor Ana, maybe one or two more questions, and we'll do closing.
Yes. Yes, I have two more, I think, relevant question to the sharing of Professor Paulo. This one is coming from our friends from think tanks. No, how should Asia, or more particularly ASEAN, face the powers referring to United States, China, and Russia? Is it possible for countries to have mutually beneficial relation with America, to also have mutually beneficial relation with China as well as Russia? So that's the question. So this is more on regional perspective, I think. No, of course, the Philippines is part and parcel of ASEAN.
To add on this, since it's related, for the experts, there's a question from one of our faculty friends from the College of Law, UP College of Law, asking is, one of the problems or the global instability is because these great powers are also playing a hardball I hope it's okay to take liberty to summarize the question. The U.S., China, Russia, they're showing their powers as well, flexing their muscles. Do you see these three superpowers adjusting, no, given the challenges and the risks that they are creating? Thank you.
Yes, Professor. Let's go to Professor Bobby, then Sir George, and then last is Dr. Dan. Professor Bobby.
Well, a power competition among major countries has always been with us. It has always been with the international system. But I would like to adjust this perspective by saying that it is actually the US that is the more aggressive actor, and China is more preoccupied with its economic development, economic growth, and the trend, as I was saying before, particularly in Asia, is towards closer economic cooperation, like the RCEP, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS. You see, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa is expanding with more and more countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Argentina applying for membership. I don't see how this power competition will deteriorate into open war based on the principle of the so-called Thucydides trap, where one power is rising and the other power tries to resist the rising power. I still don't see that coming. The more important thing is for the Philippines to really do its own housekeeping, to keep its communications and foreign relations open, to be friends to everyone, enemies to no one, because after all, you cannot get any desirable results from going into some hostile and acrimonious relationship with many countries of the world.
Thank you, Professor Bobby. Sir George, then Dr. Dan.
From a power perspective, from a tactical perspective, it's understandable why the U.S. may want, or certain sectors of the U.S. government may want to provoke a more confrontational position, because based on the graphs of development, China keeps advancing in all sectors, and if they keep at this track and the US keeps at its track, at some point, without having to go to war, China would simply overtake the US in all different dimensions. So it's like a power, you want to suppress someone before they become too powerful. So from a tactical perspective, it's understandable, and that's why we should be very careful. And we can see that the US is not reducing and not trying to harmonize, but it keeps trying to expand the areas of potential competition and conflict. So we're talking about currency. In fact, Philippines could very easily get involved. Recently, last year, or when they used the hex code of the Philippine civilian aircrafts to go to the borders of China, it could easily have been construed that the Philippines was getting involved in this of this spying or invading China airspace. But the Philippines DFA did not really complain. It's a wonder, no? So are we? And the same that U.S. submarines have been going to the very edge, to the Hainan Island, and they're planning to they're asking for more bases here in the Philippines. So from a gaming perspective, we understand that. We just have to play the game as well, no? Because China currently has surpassed the US in the number of patents, not in quality, but in number of patents already. They put up a space station that is far advanced of that of the US. They are advancing in AI and in robotics way beyond the level the US is at. But the US is by far still ahead, very, very much by far ahead in military and primary research technology. They have geniuses because the US system is very good in attracting talents from around the world. And China has a lot of talents, but they're primarily Chinese talents, although they're trying to attract foreign talents. And the US has been very, so you have people like Elon Musk from South Africa, Steve Jobs from Syria, and these other countries. So we're looking at this. There are certain sectors that want a confrontation earlier rather than later. I think if we bypass this period and we can dance our way around this period, then it would be, it would be smoother sailing afterwards. So we just have to know how to position and to play the game.
Thank you, Sir George. Dr. Dan, yes, quick respond to the question.
Dr. Dan was only supposed to stay with us for an hour. He stayed for more than
sorry.
Okay. He's being
okay, no problem.
World governments given the challenges today. So we hope that he will be available. He said that he will answer our email. So please send your questions directly. And of course, he's on Manila Times on a regular column. So we'll send those to you via email as well. Please do keep in touch, and maybe one more closing statement from our experts, and we will save the other.
Okay, let's move to the next part of our webinar. Before that, thank you very much to our esteemed speakers for the extensive and elaborate answers to all the questions. Very much appreciated, gentlemen. On that note, let me call on Professor Bobby Tuazon for his closing statement, followed by Mr. George C. also for his closing statement. Thank you. Sir Bobby?
Well, as usual, I'd like to thank EDC, George, Austin, also, of course, our most able host, Anna, for this opportunity to interact. I have heard many interesting views, alternative insights, although I would like to add that it's not all dark. It's not all dark. It's not all bleak. There is always a shining light at the end of the tunnel. And let's be more positive. Let's choose who our friends are. Let's be careful to friends who claim to be our friends, but who have given us a lot of troubles already. So that's the mess. So congratulations, EDC. And by the way, if I may plug George, Anna.
Yes, sir.
On July 23, CENPEG is organizing a SONA, a pre-SONA forum. We call it the State of the Presidency. So we will send the invitation to you, to EDC, to our friends from the media and others.
Thank you.
July 23.
Thank you, sir, for that. We'll be waiting for the invitation, sir. Yes, Sir George.
Yes, I think they've had heard our mouthfuls already for this whole afternoon. We hope that soon, if we have some kind of physical get-together, we can all have a drink and a little chica and food together. We want to thank everyone who joined today. For you, Anna, Austin, organizing, Professor Bobby, Dan, who has left us, and of course, all our media friends, the people from friends from the academe and from the military and other sectors, the students. Let's all work together it's an exciting time. I think there's a lot of optimism. Originally, there was a lot of negativity. I think a lot of them have become open-minded that we do have a lot of things to be looking forward to. Let's work together towards that upgrade. Our objective is not to criticize, although we do critique. Our objective is to get everybody working together. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sir George. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, our webinar has officially ended. On behalf of EDC, difference groups, CENPEG, and Fieldbricks, the organizer of this webinar, I would like to express our sincere thanks to everyone who joined and participated in this online webinar. We hope you've learned something from excellent and esteemed speakers. So have a great day, everyone.
we
Stay
ask a
safe and
copy
healthy.
By the way, just and Anna, we are
Dr.
going to open
Steinbock's
it for
slides?
informal. No more recording. We're going
Yes, yes. I am about to say that.
okay, for those who want to
Okay.
pay.
I was
Yes,
going
yes.
to ask if we can have a copy of Dr. Steinbock's slides.
Yes, slides, actually, the presentation of Dr. Steinbock. By the way, we still have some time before we turn off our Zoom. Probably can still have more relaxed conversation with anyone who would want to participate and speak directly. You can ask questions, no? Directly to our speakers, and Sir George and Professor Bobby is still here. Austin is still here. So anyone